for February. And I'm David Brown, the Ship and Goods Specialist with University of Missouri Extension. And once again, like I said, you're welcome to our MU Ship and Goods monthly webinar series. Just a few information before we have Dr. Richard Browning take over the presentation today. Please kindly note that this webinar session is recorded and it will be available, on MU Ship and Good YouTube channel. We also send that to everyone that has joined today. We're going to send the recording to you and also the PDF version of this presentation. And secondly, if you have any question, as always, please feel free to type in your questions in the chat box. Dr. Richard and I will monitor that and we endeavor to answer some of the questions you may have in the course of the presentation. And straight to the point, today we have our guest speaker in the person of Dr. Richard Browning Jr. He's a professor in the Department of Animal Science at Tennessee State University, and we're so happy to have him join us today. He's going to be talking today on Fescue toxicosis in sheep and goat. Dr. Browning, over to you, and thank you for joining us today.
All right. Well, thanks, David, for the invitation, and I certainly look forward to interacting with the group. And I'm guessing everybody's pretty much in some part of Missouri. Um, I've made a lot of trips up in Missouri over the last few years, picking up cattle and bringing them back to the research for our cattle program, cattle research projects. But today I was asked to speak about goats, and we still do goat work here, and in particular dealing with fescue toxicosis. And the interesting thing about fescue toxicosis, from our perspective, is that that's how we transitioned our research program from cattle to goats. So we're doing a lot of fescue toxicosis work with beef cattle. And then when there was a change where we switched over to goats, we just kind of moved some of that early work with cattle that we were doing into goats. And so we'll talk about some of those numbers. But anyhow, if you're grazing animals in this part of the country, Tennessee, Missouri, Arkansas, what have you, you're probably gonna be dealing with fescue toxic, you're dealing with tall fescue. So now, one thing you'll probably notice is that something happened with my PowerPoint presentation, so I'm reverting to the handout. So you see me kind of moving back and forth is because I'm using the handout version of this presentation. So I'll be kind of scrolling back and forth and round and round to get through this. So everybody familiar with tall fescue, I'm guessing. Has everybody seen the slide set? Do I have it posted?
No, not yet.
Oh, okay. I was wondering if it was being shared or not. Let me open it up right quick. Let me get it shared. Okay, are we up now?
Yes, Dr. Browning, yes,
Okay,
it's
let me
up
go
now.
back to the title slide. So again, like I said, we're using the handout version of this presentation, so you have to kind of bear with me on that. But so we're going to be talking about the potential impact of tall fescue on small ruminant production. And as I said, this is something that we started working on when we first got into meat goats back in 2002. And before that, we were doing research with cattle. And of course, if you're grazing animals in this part of the country, everybody dealing with some tall fescue in their pastures for the most part. And way back when tall fescue was first introduced, it was seen as a wonder grass because it grew so well. It was a very hardy pasture forage grass. But it wasn't too long after we started seeing producers introducing tall fescue that producers started indicating they were having problems with their animals, primarily cattle, some work with sheep as well. And that led to, it's probably been 70, 80 years of studies on fescue toxicosis in cattle and in horses and in small ruminants. Not so much in small ruminants as in cattle and horses. So when we start thinking about this issue of tall fescue, we're talking on the plant side or on the animal side. On the plant side, it's positive. Tall fescue is drought tolerant. the tall fescue is able to withstand pests, so it's a really hardy grass in that regard, and disease protection. So if you were to go out and and look at a stand of tall fescue versus other grasses, the tall fescue seems to be the hardiest, the most vigorous grass out there. It's because of all the benefits that the plant derives from the compounds that are produced by this fungus. Now, on the negative side, in livestock, we see fescue toxicosis, we see fescue, or we see fat necrosis, and in the wintertime, we'll see fescue foot, which is a condition where because of the loss of blood flow or vasoconstriction, you see problems with their feet primarily. And there's been cases, farther north of us where hooves just actually fall off of the animals in the wintertime because of the vasoconstriction that occurs in the loss of blood flow. So, if y'all been sitting in any, grazing conferences or meetings, or you're studying, forages in this part of the country, you know that tall fescue is the primary forage that you'll hear talk about, particularly in terms of cool season perennial forages. And of course, Tennessee is right in the middle of what we call the fescue belt, and Missouri, most of Missouri is also within this region. So this is an area of where tall fescue and fescue toxicosis is of great concern in our livestock production systems. So what we have, and I thought I had a slide to show this, in the grass, incorporate within the cell wall, between those cell walls, we have this endophyte, or this fungus. And so the fungus and the grass, they have a symbiotic relationship. On the fungus side, it produces a number of compounds we call ergot alkaloids primarily, that um, provide the grass with protection. And interestingly enough, most of these ergot alkaloid compounds have a base structure that is similar to these neurotransmitters, dopamine, serotonin, and norepinephrine. And that's where we start seeing these adverse effects of animals consuming the endophyte infected tall fescue on animal performance and basic animal well-being. So just keep in mind dopamine, serotonin, and norepinephrine. So we've seen where ergot alkaloids alter appetite control in animals, cardiovascular function, hormonal activity, gastrointestinal activity, muscle contractions, and body temperature regulation. These are all responses that have been measured in livestock in response to consuming endophyte infected tall fescue. So if you pay attention to that list, what are some things that those neurotransmitters control? It's the same list. They control appetite, they control cardiovascular function, endocrine activity, gastrointestinal, everything that ergot alkaloids seem to impact in animals are the same things that those neurotransmitters, the dopamine, the serotonin, the norepinephrine control. So we see at the very basic physiological level, the compounds that are produced by the fungus or the endophyte that's found in endophyte infected tall fescue, again, they affect basic bodily functions in our animals. So we know in cattle, in the cattle industry, we're talking probably, and I put this slide together years ago, upwards of $1 billion a year in losses because of lost performance, primarily in our cattle herds. And if we were, add horses, if we were to add small ruminants, we're certainly well over $1 billion a year that's lost just because of fescue toxicosis in our production systems. So what does that look like in cattle? If we think of reproductive rates in cattle, we see that if animals, if cow herds are grazing a highly infected tall fescue pasture, that we see losses of 20, 20% or so in pregnancy rates. So if animals are on a low to no infected standard tall fescue, we have higher pregnancy rates. So reproduction is really important. But even with our growth rates, we see if cattle are on a high infected tall fescue stand, we have a reduction in growth rate, and that's where these production losses are coming into play. Lost growth and lost reproductive output. And this has been, looked at in several studies, including many of them that were done right there at the University of Missouri. So it's a real problem. And we've known it's been a problem for decades now. Of course, the first question is how do we get around it? And there are a number of options that have been offered, mostly on the plant or the pasture management side, not so many on the animal management side. And we used to go to these fescue meetings, fescue dealing with fescue toxicosis. I would say 90% of the scientists that were there were plant physiologists and plant breeders and the like. Very few animal scientists were there. Um, but it was important, to hear the plant side of the problem and the animal side of the problem because it's going to be a joint effort if we at some point find a way to get over these problems of fescue toxicosis in our livestock. One of the earliest recommendations was just get rid of the tall fescue and plant something else there. But it didn't take long for producers to realize that those, say those in the fight free stands of fescue were not very hardy, and they would die out within a couple of years or so. And so we're looking at alternatives, and there are some alternatives that are there that may or may not be practical for an individual producer's operation. And in some of the work that we were doing at TSU with cattle, because one of the problems that we see with animals that are grazing tall fescue is that they have a diminished ability to control body temperature, and they get easily heat stressed or hyperthermic. And so our approach at TSU was to introduce heat tolerant genetics, and we did a number of a series of studies over the years looking at breeds such as Brahman and Centipole. And this particular graph, real quickly, we see so we had Hereford cattle, which are the blue lines, and we had our heat tolerant Centipole cattle, which are the yellow and green. And what we noticed in these 2 years was that if we had a heat sensitive breed such as the Hereford on tall fescue, we had a reduction in growth rate, as you see for these 2 years. Whereas if we had a heat tolerant breed such as the Centipole, even though they were on in the fight infected tall fescue, we didn't see the loss in growth rate. They did show some signs of heat stress, but it didn't affect their performance. And that was our approach to looking at this in cattle. And I said we transitioned to goats back in 2002. So you see, we were at kind of the tail end of this work with cattle. And we said, okay, let's look at it in goats. And so we'll look at some of those numbers here in just a bit. So this years ago, this was a typical picture in Middle Tennessee of a goat herd. And if you notice, this goat herd is standing in a pretty mature, healthy stand of in the fight infected tall fescue. And so the question became, is this a problem in goats? We know it is in cattle, and we knew it was in horses. There's been some studies done in sheep, but what about in goats? No work had really been done in goats. And so the first thing that we did when we started to go programs to find out of our meat goat producers, what kind of pastures are they using? So we're trying to find out, is it a need for us to do this kind of work? And sure enough, the predominant pasture grass in these meat goat farms was tall fescue. And so, okay, we've got something to look at here. And that was our entry into doing meat goats is fescue toxicosis. So again, that transition from our work with cattle to working with goats. And so what we did over, I think like 4 years, we wanted to find out if we see a similar response in goats as what we saw in our cattle in terms of reductions in growth rate in tall fescue. Now, tall fescue is a cool season grass, but it's usually available throughout the summer months. It's usually seeding out. You might see a reduction in quality or in forage production in the summer, but it's going to be there. And your goats are going to consume it. As you see, we've got this boar buck was actually eating the seed heads, which is pretty significant because we know that the erga alkaloids are concentrated at a higher level in the seeds than it is in the grass, in the blades of grass. And that's kind of how we went out to, determine whether or not we would have a problem with fescue toxicosis in goats. 'Cause, when you're running goats, sometimes a little bit harder to kind of assess, particularly for heat stress, if they're heat stressed or not. Cattle, they'll get into mud holes, and we had cattle on that project sticking their head under a faucet of dripping water. They were doing everything they can to alleviate that heat stress that they were feeling because they were consuming the tall fescue. Goats are very picky eaters. And we were doing the work with the when we were doing the work with the cattle, we're feeding them fescue seed, indified infected seed, and we're feeding them at about a couple pounds per head per day. We mixing it with commercial feed, and the cattle just ate that stuff up. That ate it. When we did the same thing with the goats, interestingly enough, and we're mixing it with the feed on day one for the first two projects. On day one, they would eat up everything. They would eat the fescue seeds, their pellets, they would eat everything, or the texture feed that we're feeding. And then from day 2 to day 70, they were picking the fescue seed out, and they were leaving the fescue seed in the trough and just eating the good stuff. So those goats learned very early on to stay away from the indified infected seed because it wasn't good for them. So you notice, or it's just how much feed they left in the feed trough. We waited every day. If they're on an indified free seed, they ate all of it. If they're on a indified infected seed diet from day 2 to day 70, they left a good bit of it in the feed trough. And so goats are real particular about what they eat, and something in them triggered them to stay away from the fescue seed after day one, which was real interesting just to see how those goats responded to the fescue. So in the first 2 years, when we're looking at growth rates, and these are replacement dolings. See, we're developing these dolings. And in both of those years, now the E plus means the indified infected, or some people refer to it as hot fescue, and the indified free, or didn't have the indified, didn't have the ergoalkaloids, was in green. And these were 70-day feeding trials that we did in replicas in different pens. And we found just across the board that if those goats were consuming indified infected tall fescue, we had a reduction in growth rates in those dolings compared to if they were consuming indified free seed, which is really important for us to see because we're developing dolings, and we want them to have some adequate growth rates. And these were those that would have been fed late summer going into the fall. So I say intake unadjusted because in the first 2 years we didn't make adjustments for how much seed was being left in the feed troughs. And so we said, well, maybe we need to adjust how much seed the indified free were getting based on how much the indified infected were consuming. So we can put them on so we wanted to make sure it wasn't a seed intake issue. And so we adjusted that in the next 2 years. So in the next 2 years, again, just like we saw in the earlier 2 years, that these animals were leaving seed, particularly in 2000, they were leaving seed in the feed trough. They weren't eating it. So what we were doing, we were adjusting the seed offerings for the end of fight free goats based on what the end of fight infecteds were consuming and leaving behind the previous day. So we were doing this pretty much on a daily basis. So when we adjusted for the intake of fescue seed, so now they're eating the same amount of seed, fescue end of fight infected and end of fight free. When we adjusted for that, we had the same response in those next 2 years. So it's not only all about intake levels, there was something biological going on in those animals that was affecting their growth rates. So that's very important. So that was the first time we were able to really present information saying yes, goats are adversely affected by the consumption as a result to consuming endophyte infected tall fescue. Again, we're feeding them seed here. And so that was the paper that came out of that, and that's on our website. And we also have a fact sheet, and I might send that to David, and he can kind of get that to the group. We have a fact sheet on fescue toxicosis in goats that if y'all are interested in that, y'all certainly can kind of get a copy of that. Now, about the same time that we were doing our work with these replacement dolings, Dr. Luganbull at North Carolina State, he started doing the same thing with lactating goats. Now we're talking about mature does in the breeding herd, and he saw the same thing in terms of how much seed those does were consuming. In other words, if they were on an endophyte infected seed, that they only ate 26% of it, only a quarter of it, where if they were on an endophyte free or novel endophyte, they were eating almost all of it. And he noticed the same thing that we saw. We had reductions in growth rate, not only in the does, but also in their kids that were suckling. Whereas if the does were on an endophyte free or novel endophyte, those does were gaining weight during the lactation period, and those kids had higher growth rates. So just notice the does were actually losing weight during the lactation period, while these does were gaining weight, which is really important. So you might start seeing does losing condition from the time that they kidded and they're lactating, they're trying to raise these kids and they're losing weight all at the same time. So the tall fescue certainly has the endophyte infected tall fescue certainly has an adverse effect on these does. Now, in terms of sheep, and there's been some work done in sheep, not an awful lot in sheep, but we said that goats are real picky eaters. They know how to sift through stuff. I haven't worked with sheep all that much. I'm not sure if sheep are as picky an eater as a goat is, or they're more like a cow. They're just going to eat what's in front of them, and and they're not quite as able to sift through good feed ingredients from bad feed ingredients. Like when we fed the cattle, they ate up everything. They ate up all the seed. They just cleaned the troughs out, unlike the goats, and they suffered the ill effects of that with toxicosis. So anyhow, there was some work that was done with lambs a little while back, and we have they were testing these novel endophytes in these lambs, And we have the in the fight free, which is the green, and the in the fight infected. And if we just pay attention to in the fight free versus the in the fight infected, we see, again, just like we saw with the goats, if they're on an in the fight free diet, you're gonna have a lower growth rate. And it didn't make any difference if these were, in the spring or looking at them in the fall. You had a reduction in growth rates in these lambs. And so if you're developing replacement ewe lambs, or you're trying to grow out maybe some grass fed market lambs, the type of forage that's out there is going to make a difference. If you're carrying, if you've got spring born lambs and you're carrying them through the summer, all of our goats are spring, all our kids are spring born. And so that means those does, just like the Lugan bull work, they're going through the lactation period during that summer period when you have a lot of seed heads from fescue, and those goats, like we saw that little buck earlier on, eating those seed heads because that's what they like to eat. So it's a concern whether you're looking at a breeding herd where you're developing does, or thinking in a grass to finish grass based um, land production system. And we talk about this like with our cattle. We have a lot of folks that come to us for steers. We run these heritage breeds, and they're doing grass to finish. And so if they're doing that, you have to really pay attention to what kind of forages are out there, because if you're grazing them on primarily in the fight infected fescue, you're going to have some issues like we saw with the earlier growth numbers with the cattle. Some of these y'all have probably already seen. I just kind of reiterate this, for those that are kind of new to this and aren't really in tune to how you manage around in the fight infected tall fescue. Like I said, excuse me. Like I said, most of those meetings we would go to are mostly plant scientists there and forage managers. And so a lot of the recommendations are dealing with managing the pastures. Things such as diluting or replacing the fescue with other forages. And remember I said early on, we had in the fight free tall fescue, and people were going out and planting those seeds, but they would play out within 2 or 3 years because they could not withstand the grazing pressure of these animals, because they didn't have that fungus in there that was giving them that protection. Because when we think, okay, in the natural sense of things, this fungus is putting these alkaloids. These alkaloids, they protect the plant against pests that may be consuming that forage. Well, you might think of the cattle like a pest. They're up there trying to consume this forage also. And so with those compounds there, it curtails some of that grazing. That's that protection mechanism. But when you lose that, now it's going to be grazed probably a little bit heavier by animals. Pests are going to have a more favorable environment to consume that forage. And that's why replacing with endophyte free was a problem. And we start looking at novel endophytes to keep that endophyte. But see, can we come up with an endophyte that produces a different profile of compounds that's beneficial for the grass, but not detrimental to the livestock consuming the grass, that's grazing that grass? Certainly avoid fescue going to seed. As that plant matures, it's going to start producing those seeds, and generally those alkaloids that will be in higher concentration in the seeds. And like I said, we saw that picture earlier of that boar buck eating those seed heads. That's what goats like. That's where a lot of those alkaloids are going to be at a higher concentration. And avoid summer grazing. And that's because one of the main problems with grazing tall fescue, in the fight infected tall fescue in the summertime, is the the hyperthermia or the heat stress that those animals are going to experience. And so if you have another forage you can put those animals on, um, that would be beneficial for animal performance. And I go back up to this top bullet of diluting the fescue. So when they talk about diluting the fescue, we're talking about adding another forage in the mix. So don't have just a monoculture of fescue. Have some clover in there. Maybe put in a summer annual or another perennial, cool season perennial like orchard grass or something to kind of dilute out the fescue. So now you have a pasture that has multiple forage types. And I made a note earlier about sheep maybe being at greater risk. Part of that is because goats have a wider variety of plant material that they will consume because goats are typically more browsers and they're grazers. So they eat a lot of different things, maybe more so than what a sheep may eat. A sheep may be more confined to just grazing that grass, and they're going to potentially consume more of those ergoalkaloid compounds. They're going to have adverse effects on their physiology, on their well-being, and on their performance. So again, I think this image was just to kind of to demonstrate, we've got this fescue. You see what this goat is eating, and they're going to consume the fescue. Now they may not consume it at high enough rates in some circumstances to cause them problems if they have variety in terms of the diet. Because goats they like to eat a lot. They like to eat a little bit here, a little bit of there, and so if they have variety, then you may not see those adverse effects. But if you're grazing these goats in primarily fescue, then you're going to see some issues. And one thing about the fescue, it could be subclinical. We think of fescue, and I think one of the terms that you'll hear in terms of cattle is summer slump. That's another term for animals, particularly cattle that are consuming fescue in the summertime. They really go down in the summer. You might not see that with the goats, but that doesn't mean that you're losing pounds because those animals aren't performing, they're not growing. And that's why it's important. And I've always been a big advocate, even for meat goats, performance recording. Let me see how these animals are doing. Are they putting on the weight that I expect them to put on? And if they're not, one of the culprits may be because they have a primarily tall fescue pasture they're being expected to perform in. So we want to provide variety, find some kind of way to not necessarily kill out the fescue, but provide diversity not only for the goats but also for the sheep. And they can utilize because minus the fescue, minus the endophyte, tall fescue is in terms of nutritional value, it's a good grass, it's a good forage. But it's the fungus, is the endophyte that causes the problem. So we can dilute that out, with some other grazing options, then that will allow us to still utilize some tall fescue in our pastures. Now, the novel endophyte, I haven't looked at novel endophyte seeds lately, but I remember when we were working on this, they were very expensive. I'm not sure and somebody on here may know, when we get to the Q&A, may be able to tell me what is the difference, per pound or per 50-pound bag? What is the cost for Kentucky 31 seed versus a novel endophyte seed? I'm assuming they're still selling novel endophytes. I haven't looked in a while. But that was one of the constraints to putting in novel endophytes. The seeds were so high. And some people say, well, horse people can afford that, but cattle folks and goat people, they may not be able to put out, the cost for putting in the fight fescue seed, not to mention the fact that that pasture is going to be out of production for a year while that stand gets established, and all the other costs associated with pasture renovation, because everything has a cost. And if you're doing it and you're trying to make money, and you're looking at that very nice stand of tall fescue, you look, you're like, man, that's gonna cost me a lot of money to kill off this really nice, healthy stand. But that's the question that you have to deal with if you're grazing animals on fescue in that fescue belt. So I think that's what I have in terms of the presentation. Certainly appreciate y'all's interest. I'm gonna see. Let me see if I can find this fact sheet right quick. And I could put that up, and you all would be able to download that. But David, while I'm looking for that, I mean, you could certainly open the floor up for questions.
All
If
right, yeah, I think I've got the fact sheet, and we're going to send that across to everyone that joined today with your PDF presentation. So, Dr. Brandon, from your research, someone wants to find out if you think sheep metabolize fescue differently than cattle. From the research, I know you work more with meat goat, but do you think sheep metabolize fescue differently than cattle?
sheep versus cattle,
Yep.
um, if they asked about goats, I said, yeah, because we know goats they metabolize compounds a little bit faster than cattle. I'm not so sure about sheep and goats. I couldn't say definitively that they do or that they don't. Um, and I'm not sure if anybody's looked at those studies to see if there's any difference. But when we think of goats, they certainly have a higher level of and at one point people used to think that goats were somewhat immune to tall fescue toxicosis because they metabolize things so fast. But that was the work that we did shows that no, they may not show any clinical signs of going laying in a mud hole, but they still are going to show some adverse effects on on um, on animal performance. Now, the one thing we have not looked at in goats, I've looked to see if they've done it in sheep. Um, there hasn't been much work on fertility in these goats or fertility in the sheep. There was one review article that was done with livestock, and in that paper it appeared that the sheep were not quite as prone to infertility and low pregnancy rates as cattle were. But the thing about sheep and goats is that they're bred in the cooler time of the year. So it could be a function of when these animals are being bred as a as they're consuming fescue, because we typically don't breed sheep and goats in the summertime. We typically breed them in the fall when the heat is not as big of a factor on those animals. So that's something to kind of keep in mind. Um, so yeah, do sheep metabolize the compounds differently than cattle? That I don't know.
Okay. And I think you cover these in your research on the adverse effects of tough SQ on productivity, and somebody wants to know if I was told it doesn't affect small ruminant reproduction in the same way. Is that true or false?
Say that again now.
Um,
Repeat the
you,
question.
yeah, the person wanted to find out if tough SQ affects small ruminant reproduction the same way it does with cattle.
Yeah. I think we just addressed that.
Yes.
Um, I'm not sure if anybody's even studied. Well, there was some work early on in sheep, and those studies didn't find any adverse effects. But this work that was done back in the 70s or 80s or so. But what I would need to go in and see is when were those ewes bred? Because if they were bred in October, November, then we may not see an effect on fertility if heat stress if the heat stress that's induced by infected tall fescue, if that's part of the problem. So we know that heat stress lowers reproductive output in ruminant livestock for sure. If we're breeding cows on fescue, like what we do at TSU, we put our bulls go out July the 1st. And if they're on fescue, that's going to really hammer your pregnancy rates in those cows. But we don't breed sheep in the summer typically. and we don't breed goats in the summer typically. And so that might be the reason why we haven't seen any studies showing adverse effects of endophyte infected tall fescue on pregnancy rates or fertility levels in our small ruminants.
Okay. Yeah, I think so. Matt Webb, thank you for the information on the novel fescue variety. I think the price $3.50 to $5 per pound. As compared to Kentucky 31, that was about $2 per pound. So, Dr. Brownie, I think there's a question on how do you identify what fescue you have? How does a person know which type of fescue they have? Does stopping seed heads off before turning out? So I think she wants to find out what kind of fescue. How do you identify the kind of fescue you have? If it's either indified affected or free from indified from your pasture.
Okay, so first of all, when you go out and look at a standard pasture, you can't tell just by looking at it. You actually have to take samples, and I think most states in the southeast, at least they used to, because we haven't done fescue work in a while. You can send in samples, forage samples, and and um and what they will do, they will determine, you send in like maybe 50 samples, and they will go in and they have a test. They can tell you how many of those samples, how many of those grass samples have the endophyte. They'll tell you it's 10% infected or 70% infected, what have you. That's when we were doing this, that's what we would do. We would take, I think we're sending in like 100 samples to our extension office, and they would run a dye test, and they would tell you how many of those samples actually had the fungus in it. And that's the easiest way. And Dave, you may know from extension, or they providing those. Do you know that they do those tests there in
Yes,
Missouri?
yes.
Okay. So you would just get with David or get with your county agent and say, I want to test my pasture to see what level of infection I'm dealing with in my, for my grazing system. And they'll probably give you the instructions on how to collect the sample, how to package the sample, and where to send the sample off to.
Great. So, Dr. Brown, what about certain breeds of goats? Are there certain breeds of goat that can handle heat stress better than others? Similar to how certain breed of cattle can handle it better than each other. So, what would you say about breeds of goat handling heat stress to one another?
Okay. We haven't done much work on what breeds could handle the end of fight better. When we were doing that work with those Dolans, we were running boar and Kiko, primarily boar and Kiko, and I don't recall there being a difference between the breeds. Both of them show, you know, problems with growth rate. And if you remember back when we were looking at the cattle, interestingly enough, and I was kind of surprised that our heat tolerant cattle, our centerpole cattle, they were showing signs of heat stress, but they were still able to put on weight. We haven't seen that with our goats, and so I would not go in saying that any one breed of goat, um, because the data's not there. I wouldn't say any one breed of goat is better on tall fescue than the other. If I were looking at that, I would first want to find out, is there any one breed of goat that seems to be more heat tolerant? Because for us, that was the deciding factor. Was that breed heat tolerant or not? And most of our goats come from warm climates anyhow. Most of our meat goats come from warm climates. So until some work has been done to show me, yeah, one breed of goat is more heat tolerant than the other, I would say they would be similarly sensitive to tall fescue. Now, one thing that may play a role, because we know some of our meat goats, they're more sensitive to internal parasites than others, and we don't know why that is. And one thing that we speculated is that it may be because they have different grazing behaviors, different feeding behaviors. And maybe if one breed of goat has a different feeding behavior, maybe they eat more variety than another, that could also play a role. So that's a lot of that's a lot of questions that Dave, you're talking about doing some research. They give you some good research questions to kind of start thinking about, in terms of why are we seeing these problems of fescue toxicosis in these goats? Are there any breed differences in response to end-of-fight infected tall fescue?
Oh, great. And I think with some of the questions we have, Dr. Tim also is part of the Alliance for Grassland Renewal, and they
Right.
have useful resource for those with questions on tall fescue toxicosis. Dr. Brown, what about, I think I've also had the fact that sometimes, somebody's asking, is there any research that points to abnormally thick placentas in goats from eating identified infected fescue? Um, and I think I read that in your one of the your research on delivery taking placentas in the week of offsprings. Does that affect sheep and goat too?
Um, we haven't seen it. They'll thicken placenta. I think that's most evident in foals in mares that are foaling. That when those foals are born, you got a really thick placenta. Some of them to the point where the foal has a difficult time really, escaping that to breathe. I've heard of it on occasion in cattle, but nothing significant. But that's really something geared towards horses. And like I said, we haven't noticed it in the research herd, and I'm not sure if anybody studied that in goats. One thing about you'll hear a lot you'll hear a lot of we're not sure because we don't do nearly as much research in small ruminants like we do in cattle and some other species. And like this work that we did with just simply feeding the goats to look at growth rate, that hadn't been done up to that point. And that was in
Mm,
2002. We have been studying fescue toxicosis in cattle for up at that point 50 or 60 years. And nobody really thought, well, is it a problem in goats? And so, like, again, that's how we kind of transitioned from cattle to goats with that simple research question. But we haven't done anything on the research side in terms of reproduction, you know, lower pregnancy rates, any issues with thickened placentas. Another thing that you'll find is horses probably more so than others. You have a reduction in milk yield. Killing a mare, she might not be producing hardly any milk
mm,
because of the adverse effects of those neurotransmitters. Cows will have a lower level of milk, but they won't be totally agalactic like a mare will. So there's certainly some species differences in how they respond to these ergot alkaloids that they're consuming um, as a consequence of grazing in the fight infected tall fescue. But y'all have a lot of good questions, I have to say.
yeah, we're going to take one more too before I let you go, Dr. Brownie.
Okay.
Someone wanted to find out if the bad endophyte can spread to the novel endophyte, or does it only stay put in the grass that's in it? They wanted to know if you have the novel fescue and the endophyte infected, can the endophyte spread to the novel fescue? Which,
Okay.
yeah.
So it's not gonna be we don't the issue is not the endophyte spreading from plant to plant. The issue that we deal with, because it's transmitted, it's through the seed, and then it kind of it grows out with the plant itself. The issue that we're looking at is encroachment of endophyte infected plants. You might have an entire stand of endophyte free, but if you have seeds that are somehow, for whatever reason, because of water or birds or wind or what have you, or you have some dormant seeds in the soil, as those endophyte infected seeds come up, and if they're more competitive compared to an endophyte free, then over time you might see a stand go from 100% endophyte free to maybe 50% endophyte free over the course of a number of years. And if you graze it and you do it long enough, you might find out after a few years it's mostly endophyte infected again. That's because of the encroachment of endophyte infected seeds into that grazing area, into that land. Because if the endophyte infected is more competitive, then it's going to eventually push out the endophyte free or orchard grass or timothy or some other forest that you put out there. And so the fungus isn't actually moving from plant to plant. It's just endophyte infected seed being reintroduced through some mechanism back into those stands and being a more competitive forage species. And that's really, that's why fescue is so prominent here, is because it's such a competitive forage in terms of withstanding all the stressors that a stand of grass are going to encounter, like I said, drought and diseases and pests and grazing, overgrazing, what have you. Endophyte infected tall fescue can withstand a lot of those pressures more so than most of our other cool season forages that we deal with.
Right. Dr. Evans, you want to please say something about the Alliance for Grassland Renewal before we call it a day today, please, Dr. T?
Wow. Well, thank you, David. You're a very brave man to actually let me talk. So that's a scary thing. I'm going to right now. Uh, let's see. I was going to try and add the website to the Alliance for Grassland Renewal. But one of the comments. Thank you, Dr. Browning, so much for your presentation. I really enjoyed it. And again, there's a uh, there's again, I agree with what you've noticed. One of the things that I think is important is um, animals seem to be able to adapt to the toxic endophyte infected tall fescue. And there is some data from sheep, but these were naive sheep. They had never been exposed to it, and they showed some fairly profound uh, changes in the placenta. And so there's these, there's a lot of these. I don't know. We did, we haven't done it, but there are some genetics that may be resistant. The fact that boar goats and many of the goats you've talked about uh, are come from hot areas in the world, they may adapt very well. Uh, and in addition, we see a lot in the cattle that some do very well, some don't do very well, and there's a certain degree of adaptation that seems to be observed. That's about as brief, David, as I'm ever going to be. So there you go.
Thank you so much, Dr. Evans. I appreciate you. I'm going to call it a day today. I want to thank everyone that has joined us. We still have some questions in here. We're going to, I'll try and monitor that and send the answer across to us or reach out to Dr. Richard. All the materials will be sent to everyone that has joined today. In case you have any further question, please feel free to reach out to us in the office. And once again, thank you, Dr. Browning, Dr. Evans. Thank you for your comment. And everyone that has joined us today, thank you so much for joining and have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye.
All right.
David, I just put that link. I just put
Okay.
that. I just put the link for the Alliance for Grassland Renewal that may provide some. And one thing I would say is they are looking now at a partial renovation. Some work from Arkansas has talked about doing a renovation of 25% of your pastures, showing some economic uh, advantages. So perhaps looking at a more moderate approach to pasture renewal might be something that would be helpful to goat and sheep producers in a different setting. But again, it has to be a strategic and intentional investment of time and figuring out what's going on and talking to smart people like you and Dr. Browning. They're going to get all the right advice. So there we go.
Thank you. So we have that, on the in the chat box. Thank you, Dr. Evans. We have the link to that, and also the link to the PDF for Dr. Browning. Thank you once again for joining us today, and we wish you the enjoy the rest of your day. See you next month. Bye.
So David, I'll send you the that link is for the fact sheet, but I'm gonna send you these slides, the PowerPoint slides, and you kind of get those out there.